This is Houston, contact with a test. 1, 2, 3.
Every 4 computers now have primary control of critical vehicle functions.
Godspeed, John Glenn.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
It was once the greatest nation that ever existed. Its fertile land was the breadbasket for other less developed nations. It was a haven for many oppressed peoples during times of famine and war, including God's people. And it was also a very formidable military power. Its scientists had a deep knowledge of astronomy and geometry, reflected in its towering feats of architecture, many of which remain to this day as mysterious monuments of its former greatness. It was the envy of lesser nations. The nation that once stood above all others was Egypt. Other than Israel, no nation is mentioned as frequently in the Holy Scriptures. Though buried beneath the on-sweeping sands of time, the ancient land of the Pharaohs is considered to be one of the original foundational pillars upon which Western civilization has been built. As one of the primary nations of Bible times, and coming under God's judgment on more than one occasion, Egypt foreshadows the greatest nation on earth at the time when Christ's kingdom comes to power. The far-reaching prophecy of Ezekiel likens Egypt to a giant cedar tree. No other tree in all the Garden of Eden could compare to it. All the peoples wanted to live under the shade of the majestic cedar. All the other trees in God's garden of tree-like nations envied it. But God gives the command to cut it down, and its downfall shocks the world. Why is the giant cedar tree depicted as being in the garden of God? When Adam and Eve were expelled from the paradise of pleasure, and especially after the flood and Tower of Babel fiasco, God has allowed for humans to exercise authority in His behalf, temporarily. The Christian apostle explained God's arrangement in the 13th chapter of Romans, when he said, "Let every person be in subjection to the superior authorities, for there is no authority except by God. The existing authorities stand placed in their relative positions by God." So the symbolic Garden of Eden is simply the interim arrangement of nations for which God has made provision. But of all the nations in God's garden, America has had a special role in the outworking of Jehovah's purpose, just as did Egypt in ancient times. In what way? Knowing as we do that God's purpose is to have the good news preached throughout the earth, it was obviously by divine providence that the reappearance of an anointed congregation in the latter part of the 19th century took place in eastern Pennsylvania, USA. America was a fertile seedbed for the truth back then. Not only had it been settled originally by devout Bible-reading pilgrims seeking refuge from the tyranny of the churches of Europe, but the nation builders who followed them purposely enshrined in their Bill of Rights liberties that have facilitated the work of first the international Bible students and Jehovah's Witnesses, now to this very day. The guarantees of freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of speech have served to protect Jehovah's Witnesses and the organization of the Watchtower Bible Society from having their unpopular work hindered or restricted in any way. And even though America has been involved in both world wars, because two great oceans insulate it from the tumultuous Eastern Hemisphere, the homeland has never been racked with war. In that respect, and in many other ways, God has blessed America, presumably specifically so that His people may finish their assigned work. As Paul exhorted, "First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made concerning all sorts of men, concerning kings and those who are in high positions, that we may go on leading a calm and quiet life with complete godly devotion and seriousness." Jesus foretold that the good news of the kingdom would be preached in all the world, and then the end would come. The end of what, though? The end of Christianity. At least the end of the teaching and disciple-making work. That is what the time of the end is, the conclusion of the Christian system, the end of the gospel age. And according to Ezekiel, the fall of the Egyptian cedar initiates the day of Jehovah, or the day of the Lord, as it is worded in the Greek scriptures, they being one and the same. Son of man, prophesy and say, "This is what the sovereign Lord Jehovah says. Wail, alas, the day is coming, for the day is near, yes, a day of Jehovah is near. It will be a day of clouds, an appointed time of nations." Of course, when Babylon overthrew Egypt, it was not the end of Egypt entirely. The prophecy foretells that it was the end of its preeminence. A sword will come against Egypt, and panic will overtake Ethiopia when the slain fall in Egypt. Its wealth is taken, and its foundations are torn down. In saying its wealth will be taken, the process is already well underway. Since the height of America's greatness following its victory in the Second World War, the United States has gone from being the greatest creditor nation to the world's biggest debtor in one generation. At this late date, the United States is far beyond bankrupt and merely maintains solvency due to the U.S. dollar being the world's reserve currency and the so-called petrodollar being required in all petroleum purchases. But that world order is changing. China has emerged as the world's new economic powerhouse. Its currency has been added to the IMF's basket of currencies to supplant the dollar as the reserve currency. Because of U.S. sanctions and economic warfare against targeted regimes, numerous nations are banding together to ditch the dollar and the petrodollar and use other currencies for trade. Inevitably, at some point in the not-too-distant future, the trillions and trillions of dollars that have been issued to facilitate trade will be returned to the issuer, resulting in the hyperinflationary destruction of the dollar and the downfall of America. No doubt the sword of war will also be involved. Even now, Russia and China are moving rapidly to prepare for nuclear war. The prophecies of Daniel and Revelation confirm the downfall of the leading nation of the world. Revelation depicts the ruling head of the symbolic seven-headed wild beast receiving a mortal wound, whereas the 11th chapter of Daniel foretells that Egypt will not escape the king of the north, but that the king of the north will rule over its gold, silver, and hidden treasures. Egypt, as a territory of the Persian Empire, became the original king of the south after the death of Alexander the Great, when his empire was divided into 4 kingdoms. During the time of the end, Egypt represents the American king of the south. No doubt, Egypt being subjugated by the king of the north, losing ownership of its gold and silver and other treasures, portends the creditors of the USA seizing whatever physical assets may be taken, including the gold in Fort Knox. Likely the government itself, with its 3 branches, its Congress, Supreme Court, and executive branch, will be dissolved. In its place, a dictatorial tyrant will reign. This is confirmed in the 19th chapter of Isaiah. I will hand Egypt over to a hard master, and a harsh king will rule over them, declares the true Lord, Jehovah of armies. This harsh king is undoubtedly the 8th king of Bible prophecy, the last king who was destined to rule the world for a symbolic 1 hour. The 8th chapter of Daniel portrays this harsh king as a fierce-looking king, no doubt in reference to his disposition to destroy. Although the Watchtower exalts itself as Jehovah's official earthly mouthpiece, and the governing body consider themselves to be prophets, in the sense of having sole authority to interpret Bible prophecy, ironically, the would-be seers of things to come are oblivious to the significance of a whole range of prophecies dealing with the earth-shaking events to be initiated at the downfall of America. Consequently, as a result of the blindness of the leadership, Jehovah's Witnesses know nothing of these vital matters. For example, the Watchtower claims that the Egyptian cedar tree represents all nations and not a specific nation, even though the prophecy obviously reveals Egypt to be the greatest nation in relation to lesser nations. Furthermore, the tyrants of the nations who fell the mighty cedar are said to be Jesus Christ. The Watchtower claims the head of the wild beast received its mortal wound a century ago, during the First World War, a war from which the United States emerged fairly unscathed. And supposedly the Soviet King of the North ruled over America's wealth during the Cold War, exactly the opposite of reality. And the 8th king is said to have begun ruling the world in 1922, when the League of Nations was instituted. Although, if true, that would mean that almost everyone who has lived since then has already been marked with the 666 mark of doom, signifying that their names are blotted out of Jehovah's Book of Life. How absurd. But how could the leadership of Jehovah's Witnesses be so uninformed in these matters? The prophecy of Ezekiel explains. The word of Jehovah again came to me, saying, Son of man, prophesy against the prophets of Israel, and say to those who fabricate their own prophecies, Hear the word of Jehovah. This is what the sovereign Lord Jehovah says, Woe to the stupid prophets who follow their own spirit when they have seen nothing. Because you have spoken what is false and your visions are a lie. I am against you, declares the sovereign Lord Jehovah. My hand is against the prophets, whose visions are false and who foretell a lie. They will not be among the people with whom I confide, nor will they be written in the registry of the house of Israel, nor will they return to the land of Israel. And you will have to know that I am the sovereign Lord Jehovah. All of this is because you have led my people astray by saying, "There is peace," when there is no peace. When a flimsy partition wall is built, they are plastering it with whitewash. Tell those plastering with whitewash that it will fall. A torrential downpour will come. Hailstones will fall, and powerful windstorms will break it down. And when the wall falls, you will be asked, "Where is your coating of plaster?" Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord Jehovah says: I will cause powerful windstorms to burst forth in my wrath, and a torrential downpour in my anger, and hailstones in destructive fury. I will tear down the wall that you plastered with whitewash, and bring it down to the earth, and its foundation will be exposed. When the city falls, you will perish within her, and you will have to know that I am Jehovah. The Watchtower's interpretation of prophecy, ultimately tied to the supposed second coming of Christ in 1914, is like a flimsy wall. Year after year, more whitewash is plastered on it to conceal the flaws. But it will be exposed as the nonsense that it is when the world is plunged into chaos with the downfall of America, causing the whitewashed wall to fall, and with it, bringing an end to the influence of the stupid prophets.